6,000 years ago, someone left a bowl of wet flour sitting in the Egyptian sun and forgot about it. By the next morning, something had changed. The paste had grown. It was full of bubbles. It smelled different, sour, alive. And when they baked it over fire, instead of the flat, dense cracker they were used to, they got something new, something soft, something that rose. That accident is the single most important moment in the history of food. And every loaf of bread you have ever eaten, every beer you have ever drunk, every bottle of wine, every piece of cheese, every bite of chocolate, every cup of coffee, every slice of salami, every spoonful of yogurt, all of it traces back to that one forgotten bowl of wet flour in the desert. Fermentation did not just change bread. Fermentation changed civilization. It allowed humans to store food through winter. It made grains digestible. It made water safe to drink. It built cities, funded empires, started wars, created religions, and shaped the biology of your gut in ways that modern medicine is only now beginning to understand. And then, about 60 years ago, we decided it was too slow. We replaced it with chemistry and machines and speed. And the consequences of that decision are sitting in your stomach right now. This is the complete history of fermentation, from a forgotten bowl in Egypt to the Industrial Revolution that nearly killed it. And if you bake bread, this is your history. This is the story of the invisible organism that made your craft possible. Subscribe, but only if you like this video and want to see more of this. Before we talk about Egypt, we need to go further back, much further. Fermentation did not begin with humans. Fermentation began without us. It is one of the oldest metabolic processes on Earth, older than photosynthesis, older than oxygen-breathing life. Single-celled organisms were fermenting sugars for energy billions of years before anything with legs existed. Yeasts and bacteria were here first. They were fermenting the sugars in rotting fruit on forest floors millions of years before any human picked one up. In fact, there is a theory in evolutionary biology that primates, our distant ancestors, developed the ability to metabolize alcohol specifically because they ate fermented fruit that had fallen from trees. The ones who could digest the alcohol got more calories from the fruit. The ones who could not got sick or avoided it. Natural selection favored the fermenters. So when humans eventually discovered fermentation, we did not invent anything. We stumbled onto a process that had been running on this planet for billions of years and figured out how to use it. The earliest evidence of intentional human fermentation comes from China. Around 7000 BC, people in the Yellow River Valley were making a fermented drink from rice, honey, and fruit. Residue analysis from pottery fragments confirms the presence of yeast fermentation byproducts. This is 9,000 years ago, before the wheel, before writing, before metal tools. Humans were fermenting. But the fermentation that changed everything happened with grain. Somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, early agricultural communities began cultivating wild grasses. Emmer wheat, einkorn, barley. These grains were hard, dry, and nearly indigestible raw. You could crack them between stones and make a porridge. You could dry them and store them for months. But they were tough on the gut and locked most of their nutrients behind compounds like phytic acid that the human digestive system could not break down efficiently. Then someone left wet grain sitting too long. Maybe it rained on the stored harvest. Maybe a bowl of porridge was forgotten overnight. Whatever happened, wild yeasts and bacteria colonized the wet grain and began to ferment it. And when that fermented grain was cooked over fire, something remarkable happened. The bread was lighter, it was softer, it was easier to eat, and people who ate it felt better than people who ate the unfermented version. They did not understand why. They did not know about lactic acid bacteria, or enzyme activation, or mineral bioavailability, but they noticed the result. Fermented grain was better, and they started doing it on purpose. This was not a small moment. This was the moment that made agriculture viable. Without fermentation, grain-based diets caused mineral deficiencies, digestive distress, and chronic inflammation over time. Populations that ate unfermented grain struggled. Populations that fermented their grain thrived. Fermentation was the missing piece that made the agricultural revolution work. By around 3000 BC, ancient Egypt had turned bread making into something approaching an industrial process. Not industrial in the modern sense. There were no factories or conveyor belts. But bread production in Egypt was organized, regulated, and central to the functioning of the entire civilization. Egypt ran on bread. Workers building the pyramids at Giza were paid in bread and beer. Both were fermented. The daily ration for a pyramid laborer was 10 loaves of bread and a measure of beer, providing the calories and nutrients needed for brutal physical labor in desert heat. If the bread failed, the workforce failed. If the workforce failed, the pyramids did not get built. Fermentation was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. Egyptian bakers used sourdough. They maintained cultures of wild yeast and bacteria that they passed from one batch to the next, just like your grandmother did thousands of years later. The technique was called backslopping. A piece of fermented dough from today's batch was saved and mixed into tomorrow's flour and water. This kept the microbial culture alive and continuous. We know this because of archaeology. Researchers have found preserved bread in Egyptian tombs. These loaves were buried with the dead as provisions for the afterlife. Analysis of these ancient breads reveals the presence of Saccharomyces cerevisiae and various lactobacillus species, the same organisms found in sourdough starters today. The biology has not changed in 5,000 years. Egyptian bread was also remarkably diverse. They made over 40 different types of bread using different grains, different shapes, different fermentation times, and different baking methods. Some were dense and flat, some were tall and airy, some were sweetened with dates or honey, some were flavored with herbs or seeds. Bread was not monotonous. It was creative, varied, and deeply embedded in daily life. The Egyptians also discovered something crucial about fermentation and beer. They noticed that the frothy residue from brewing beer could be used to make bread rise faster and higher. This was barm, the foam skimmed from fermenting beer. Bakers began using barm as a leavening agent, creating a direct link between brewing and baking that would last for thousands of years. In many cultures throughout history, the baker and the brewer were the same person, or at least neighbors, because they depended on the same microorganisms. And here is something worth sitting with. The Egyptians built one of the greatest civilizations in human history on the back of fermented bread and fermented beer. Their military, their construction projects, their religious institutions, their economy, all of it was fueled by fermentation. Not by supplements, not by processed food, not by nutrition science, by a jar of bubbly dough and the patience to let it work. The Greeks inherited fermentation knowledge from Egypt and began to study it more systematically. Greek writers documented different bread types, different fermentation methods, and different outcomes. They categorized bread by grain type, by texture, by digestibility. They were the first to write about the relationship between fermentation time and bread quality in a way that approached scientific observation. But it was Rome that turned fermentation into a system of imperial power. We covered Roman bread in detail in our previous video, but it bears repeating in this context because Rome represents the peak of ancient fermentation knowledge. Rome regulated bread production at every level. Bakers were organized into guilds called the Collegium Pistorum. Membership was hereditary and binding. Once you became a baker, your family was locked into the profession for generations. The state controlled grain supply, milling standards, and fermentation practices. Public bakeries called pistrina were inspected. The quality of bread was a matter of national security because bad bread meant civil unrest. Roman fermentation was slow by design. Dough rested for 8 to 24 hours, depending on the grain and the season. Bakers maintained their sourdough starters in clay vessels, sometimes submerged in water baths to regulate temperature. The bread that came out of Roman ovens was dense, nutritious, shelf-stable, and easy to digest. Roman soldiers marched 20 miles a day on this bread. Roman slaves built aqueducts and roads on this bread. Roman senators debated the fate of the republic on this bread. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, documented that Gauls and Iberians used the foam from beer to leaven their bread, producing what he described as a lighter loaf than other people's. He noted that different regions produced different bread because the local wild yeasts and bacteria were different. This is one of the earliest recorded observations of what we now call terroir in fermentation, the idea that location shapes flavor and behavior. The Romans also understood spoilage. They knew that bread made without proper fermentation went bad faster. They knew that acidity preserved bread. They did not know the mechanism. They did not know that lactic acid inhibits the growth of mold and pathogenic bacteria. But they observed the outcome and built their entire bread system around it. When Rome fell, the knowledge did not disappear entirely, but it fragmented. Regional traditions survived in isolated communities. Monasteries became the primary keepers of fermentation knowledge in Europe. And for the next 1,000 years, bread making would be shaped by monks, peasants, and local tradition rather than imperial regulation. The fall of Rome created a gap. Centralized bread production disappeared. Supply chains broke. Regulated bakeries closed. What replaced them was a patchwork of local traditions, each one adapting fermentation to local grains, local climates, and local microbial environments. In many parts of Europe, bread quality declined after Rome. Not because people forgot how to ferment, but because the infrastructure that supported consistent fermentation collapsed. Grain quality varied wildly. Milling was inconsistent. Ovens were shared among entire villages and available only on certain days. People ate what they could grow and bake with whatever tools they had. But fermentation survived. It had to. Without fermentation, grain-based diets were nutritionally inadequate. Communities that maintained sourdough traditions stayed healthier than those that did not. This was not a conscious choice. It was simply what worked. Monasteries played a crucial role. Benedictine and Cistercian monks were among the most skilled bakers and brewers in medieval Europe. They had the time, the discipline, and the institutional memory to maintain sourdough cultures across generations. Monastery bakeries operated continuously for centuries, with starters that were decades or even centuries old. The monks documented their methods, not in scientific terms, but in practical instructions that were passed from one generation of monks to the next. Monastic bread was often the best bread available. Local populations would travel significant distances to buy bread from monastery bakeries because it was more consistent, better tasting, and longer lasting than what they could make at home. The monks did not understand microbiology, but they understood process control. They kept their environments clean. They maintained consistent feeding schedules for their starters. They controlled temperature by choosing specific locations for fermentation, cool cellars in summer, warm rooms near the kitchen in winter. Medieval bread guilds also emerged during this period. In cities like Paris, London, and Vienna, bakers were organized into regulated guilds that controlled who could bake, how they could bake, and what they could sell. The assize of bread, established in England in 1266, was one of the earliest food regulations in European history. It set prices for bread based on the cost of grain and imposed penalties on bakers who produced underweight or adulterated loaves. These guilds maintained quality through a combination of regulation and tradition. Master bakers trained apprentices over years, passing down fermentation knowledge through direct observation and practice. A baker's apprenticeship lasted 7 years in many cities. 7 years of learning to manage sourdough, to read dough by touch and smell, to adjust for weather and grain quality and season. This was not casual knowledge. This was deep expertise transmitted over lifetimes. Rye bread dominated Northern Europe. Wheat bread dominated the South. Each grain fermented differently and required different management. Rye sourdoughs are naturally more acidic and require longer, cooler fermentation. Wheat sourdoughs are milder and more forgiving. Regional bread traditions developed around these differences, creating the diverse bread landscape that still exists in parts of Europe today. German pumpernickel, French pain de campagne, Italian ciabatta, Scandinavian rugbrod, each one a product of local grain, local bacteria, and local tradition refined over centuries. There is a detail from this period that bakers will appreciate. Medieval bakers tested their dough the same way many of us still do. They pressed a finger into the surface and watched how it responded. If the dough sprang back quickly, it needed more time. If it held the indent, it was overproofed. If it slowly crept back halfway, it was ready. This test has been passed down through 1,000 years of baking. When you press your finger into your dough tonight, you are using the same diagnostic tool that a baker in 13th century Paris used. The science behind it involves gluten relaxation and gas retention. The medieval baker did not need the science, he needed the finger. Another critical development in this period was the communal oven. In many medieval villages, there was a single oven owned by the lord of the manor. Families prepared their dough at home, maintaining their own starters and managing their own fermentation, then brought their shaped loaves to the communal oven on baking day. Each family marked their loaves with a distinctive slash or stamp so they could identify them after baking. This is the origin of bread scoring. What began as a practical identification method became an art form that bakers still practice today. The communal oven system also meant that bakers had to be precise about fermentation timing. If your dough was not ready when the oven was hot, you missed your bake. If your dough was overproofed by the time the oven was available, your bread was ruined. Managing fermentation around a shared schedule forced bakers to develop an intimate understanding of how temperature, humidity, and time affected their dough. This pressure produced expertise that was passed through families for generations. Beer and bread remained deeply connected throughout the Middle Ages. Barm, the yeasty foam from brewing, was widely used as a leavening agent, particularly in England and Northern Europe. Alehouses and bakeries were often adjacent businesses or run by the same family. The waste product of one was the essential ingredient of the other. This symbiotic relationship between brewing and baking meant that both traditions reinforced each other, keeping fermentation knowledge alive even when written records were scarce. For thousands of years, humans used fermentation without understanding it. They knew it worked, they knew how to manage it, but they did not know what was actually happening inside the dough. That began to change in the 17th century. In 1680, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch scientist and the father of microbiology, observed yeast cells under his handmade microscope. He described them as small, spherical globules, but did not connect them to fermentation. He saw the organisms, but did not understand their function. It took nearly 200 more years for the connection to be made. In the 1850s and 1860s, Louis Pasteur conducted his landmark experiments on fermentation. Pasteur proved that fermentation was caused by living microorganisms, not by spontaneous chemical reactions as many scientists believed at the time. He showed that specific organisms produced specific outcomes. Yeast produced alcohol and carbon dioxide. Bacteria produced acids. Different organisms in different conditions produced different results. This was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, fermentation was understood as a biological process that could be studied, controlled, and optimized. Pasteur's work laid the foundation for modern microbiology, modern brewing, modern winemaking, and eventually modern baking. But Pasteur's discoveries also planted the seed for something else. If fermentation was caused by specific organisms, then those organisms could be isolated. And if they could be isolated, they could be mass-produced. And if they could be mass-produced, the slow, unpredictable, regionally variable process of wild fermentation could be replaced by something fast, uniform, and controllable. In 1868, Charles Fleischmann, an Austrian immigrant to the United States, began selling standardized compressed yeast cakes. This was the first commercially available baking yeast in America. Fleischmann's yeast was a single strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, selected for its ability to produce carbon dioxide quickly and reliably. It was clean, consistent, and fast. For the first time in 6,000 years of bread making, bakers had an alternative to sourdough. They no longer needed to maintain a starter. They no longer needed to wait 12 to 24 hours for fermentation. They could add a measured amount of commercial yeast and have risen dough in 2 to 3 hours. This was marketed as progress, and in many ways, it was. Commercial yeast democratized baking. It made bread accessible to people who did not have the skill or the time to maintain a sourdough culture. It standardized results, it reduced failure rates, but it also removed the bacteria from the equation entirely. Commercial yeast produces carbon dioxide. It does not produce lactic acid. It does not produce acetic acid. It does not lower the pH of the dough. It does not activate phytase. It does not break down gluten. It does not transform the bread. It only makes it rise. For the first time in 6,000 years, bread rose without being fermented, and nobody noticed what was lost. The 20th century accelerated the separation between bread and biology at a pace that previous centuries could not have imagined. World War I disrupted grain supplies and bakery labor across Europe. Governments needed bread production to be fast, cheap, and scalable. Traditional bakeries with their slow fermentation and skilled labor could not meet wartime demand. Industrial solutions began to replace artisan methods out of necessity. World War II pushed this even further. Military bread had to be transported across oceans, stored in tropical heat, and remain edible for weeks. Sourdough could not do this reliably. Commercial yeast, preservatives, and shelf-stabilizing additives could. The bread that fed Allied soldiers was engineered for logistics, not nutrition. And the industrial systems built to produce that bread did not disappear after the war. They grew. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s created the modern supermarket, and with it, the modern expectation that bread should be soft, white, sweet, cheap, and available every day without variation. American consumers wanted convenience. Industry delivered. Then, in 1961, came the moment that broke the chain completely. British food scientists at the Chorleywood Flour Milling and Bakery Research Association developed the Chorleywood bread process. This method used high-speed mechanical mixing at speeds that physically developed gluten in minutes rather than hours, combined with chemical oxidizers, emulsifiers, extra yeast, and hard fats. The result was a loaf of bread produced from flour to plastic wrapper in under 3.5 hours. No fermentation, no acidity, no bacterial transformation, no time. Within 20 years, the Chorleywood process and its American equivalents dominated bread production in the English-speaking world. By the 1980s, over 80% of bread sold in the United Kingdom was made using this method. In the United States, industrial bread production followed similar logic with slightly different chemistry, but the same fundamental approach. Remove time, remove biology, replace with speed and additives. The neighborhood bakeries that had survived centuries of war, plague, famine, and economic upheaval could not survive the supermarket. They closed by the thousands across America and Europe. And with them went the last institutional repositories of sourdough knowledge in many communities. The starters died. The expertise was not passed on. The ovens went cold. By 1990, sourdough bread was essentially a specialty product in the United States. Something you might find at a farmer's market or an expensive artisan bakery. Something nostalgic, something niche. Not something ordinary, not something daily. Not something your mother made on Tuesday without thinking about it. 6,000 years of continuous fermentation tradition, From that forgotten bowl in Egypt through Rome and the monasteries and the guilds and the immigrant bakeries of New York and San Francisco, was reduced to a curiosity in the space of a single generation. And it is worth pausing here to talk about San Francisco specifically, because it represents one of the few places in America where sourdough survived industrialization. San Francisco sourdough has been made continuously since the gold rush of 1849, when immigrant bakers from France and other European countries brought their starters with them to California. The unique microbial environment of the Bay Area, the specific combination of wild yeasts and bacteria in the fog-cooled air, produced a distinctively tangy bread that became synonymous with the city. Boudin Bakery, founded in 1849, claims to have maintained the same mother starter for over 170 years. Whether or not the microbial culture is truly continuous from the original is debatable, but the tradition is real. San Francisco sourdough survived because it became a regional identity. It was not just bread, it was San Francisco. And that cultural attachment protected it from the industrial wave that wiped out sourdough everywhere else. The microorganism most associated with San Francisco sourdough, Lactobacillus san franciscensis, was first identified and named in 1970 by researchers studying what made this bread different. It turned out that the combination of this specific bacterium with a specific wild yeast created a flavor profile and fermentation behavior that could not be replicated anywhere else. Terroir in bread, exactly as Pliny the Elder had observed 2,000 years earlier. But San Francisco was the exception. Across the rest of America, sourdough was gone. The consequences of abandoning fermentation did not appear immediately. They accumulated over decades, slowly enough that most people did not connect them to bread. But the science is now clear, and it is extensive. Sourdough fermentation reduces phytic acid content by 60 to 90% depending on fermentation time, temperature, and flour type. Phytic acid binds minerals in the gut, making iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium unavailable for absorption. Populations that eat significant amounts of unfermented whole grains show higher rates of mineral deficiency. This is well documented in nutritional research. Sourdough fermentation partially breaks down gluten proteins through the action of bacterial proteases and the acidic environment. Studies have shown that long-fermented sourdough bread contains significantly less intact gluten than bread made with commercial yeast. This is why many people who report sensitivity to commercial bread can eat traditional sourdough without symptoms. The gluten has been pre-digested by bacteria. Sourdough bread consistently shows a lower glycemic index than bread made with commercial yeast. Multiple studies report reductions of 20 to 30%. The bacterial transformation of starches during fermentation changes how the bread interacts with blood sugar. Sourdough releases glucose more slowly, reducing insulin spikes and providing more sustained energy. This is particularly significant for people over 40, whose glucose regulation becomes less efficient with age. The organic acids produced during sourdough fermentation, primarily lactic acid and acetic acid, have antimicrobial properties that extend shelf life naturally. Traditional sourdough bread resists mold significantly longer than commercial bread without any preservatives. The acidity inhibits the growth of most common bread molds. This is why your grandmother's bread lasted a week on the counter, while commercial bread needs calcium propionate to last 3 days. Sourdough fermentation also produces B vitamins, increases the bioavailability of antioxidants, generates beneficial peptides from protein breakdown, and creates aromatic compounds that contribute to flavor complexity. None of these things happen in commercial bread because none of these things can happen without bacteria and time. The fermentation quotient, the ratio of lactic acid to acetic acid in sourdough, directly influences flavor, texture, shelf life, and nutritional profile. Traditional slow fermentation at moderate temperatures produces a balanced ratio. Industrial shortcuts that attempt to mimic sourdough by adding organic acids produce an unbalanced profile that does not replicate the biological outcomes. There is no shortcut. There is no additive that replicates what 12 hours of bacterial activity does to bread. You either ferment or you do not. And for 60 years, we chose not to. Around 2010, something shifted. Sourdough began to reappear. Food writers started covering it. Health-conscious consumers started seeking it. Instagram accounts dedicated to crumb shots and starter maintenance started gaining followers. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 accelerated this dramatically as millions of people, stuck at home, started sourdough starters for the first time. This is good. Any return to fermented bread is a positive development, but it comes with significant problems. The biggest problem is that the word sourdough has no legal protection in the United States. Any bread can be labeled sourdough regardless of how it was made. A loaf made with commercial yeast and a splash of citric acid for tang can legally be sold as sourdough bread. And many are. Major industrial bakeries now sell sourdough lines that have never been near a real starter. They use sourdough flavoring, dried sourdough powder, or simply add acids to commercial dough. The bread goes through the same rapid process as any other factory loaf. It just has the word sourdough on the package. The consumer thinks they are buying something better. They are buying marketing. Even among genuine bakeries that use real starters, the pressure to produce volume often leads to shortened fermentation times. A real sourdough needs 12 to 24 hours. Many bakeries give it 4 to 8 because they need to produce enough loaves to cover rent. The bread is better than factory bread, but it is not fully fermented. The phytic acid is only partially reduced. The gluten is only partially broken down. The glycemic index is only partially lowered. You get some of the benefits, but not all. The only way to know is to ask, how long does the dough rest? If the baker says overnight or longer, it is real. If they say a few hours, it is somewhere in between. If they cannot answer the question, it is probably not real sourdough. Or you make it yourself, which brings us to where this all started. 6,000 years of fermentation history lead to one place: your kitchen counter. A jar, flour, water, thyme. Everything you need to make real sourdough bread has been freely available for the entire history of human civilization. Wild yeasts are floating in the air around you right now. Lactobacillus bacteria are on the surface of your flour. The enzymes are inside the grain. The process is waiting to happen. All you have to do is mix flour and water and wait. A sourdough starter takes about a week to establish from scratch. Mix equal parts flour and water by weight in a clean jar. Leave it on your counter at room temperature. Feed it daily by discarding half and adding fresh flour and water. By day 3 or 4, you will see bubbles. By day 5 or 6, it will begin to rise and fall predictably. By day 7, it is ready to bake with. What you have created is a living ecosystem. Billions of organisms working in a symbiotic relationship that has not changed since ancient Egypt. The same biology, the same chemistry, the same transformation. You are not doing anything new. You are doing something ancient, something that your grandmother did, and her grandmother before her, and every generation of bread makers stretching back to the Nile. When you mix that starter into flour and water and salt and let it rest overnight, you are participating in the oldest continuous food tradition in human history. The bacteria do not care what year it is. They do not care about industrial efficiency or profit margins or shelf life. They do the same work they have always done. They eat sugar, they produce acid, they transform grain into bread, and they do it on their own schedule, not yours. That is the fundamental lesson of 6,000 years of fermentation. You do not control this process, you manage it. You create the conditions, you provide the food, you maintain the temperature, and then you wait. Patience is not optional. Patience is the ingredient. The Egyptians knew this, the Romans knew this, the monks knew this, your grandmother knew this. The factories decided it was too expensive, but the biology has not changed. The organisms are still here. The flour still contains everything it needs. The air is still full of wild yeast. The only thing that disappeared was the willingness to wait. And here is what 6,000 years of history tells us. Every time humans have tried to shortcut fermentation, the food got worse. Every time, without exception. The only bread that has ever sustained daily human consumption without causing widespread digestive problems, mineral deficiencies, or metabolic disruption is bread that was properly fermented. Not because fermentation is trendy or artisan or Instagram-worthy, because fermentation is how grain becomes food. That bowl of wet flour forgotten in the Egyptian sun was not an accident. It was an inevitability. Fermentation was always going to find us. Because without it, agriculture does not work. Grain does not nourish. Bread does not sustain. Civilization does not build. We forgot that for about 60 years. The organisms did not. Start a jar, feed it daily, give the dough time, and join a tradition that is older than writing, older than cities, older than history itself. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.